Sir, you don't belong here. Get up and leave, right now.
I'm a paying customer. You're judging me by my skin, not my actions.
That desk cost 12 grand. Don't lie to me.
You just crossed into illegal discrimination.
Good. I'm calling the police.
Sir, you don't belong here, and if you don't leave, I'm going to make you leave. Those were the first words Kyle Vance spoke to the man sitting at the mahogany executive desk. Kyle didn't ask if the man needed assistance. He didn't ask if he was looking for a specific model. He simply saw a black man in a high-end furniture showroom in downtown Chicago sitting at a desk that cost more than a Honda Civic and made a decision. It was a decision based on bias fueled by arrogance, and it was the single worst decision of Kyle Vance's 28 years of life. Because the man sitting at that desk running his hand along the grain of the imported wood wasn't just a customer. He was Marcus Thorne. And Marcus Thorne was the state attorney general. Thorne didn't look up immediately. He continued to inspect the joinery of the drawer, his face a mask of calm. He was 56 years old, a man who had spent 3 decades in courtrooms, first as a ferocious prosecutor, then as a defense attorney, and finally as the highest elected law enforcement official in the state. He wore a charcoal suit that was tailored on Savile Row, though Kyle Vance, with his off-the-rack polyester blend and scuffed loafers, wouldn't know quality if it hit him in the face. Vance only saw skin color. He saw a threat to the aesthetic of his showroom. "I'm speaking to you," Vance said, his voice rising. He was the store manager, a title he wore like a crown. He stepped closer, invading Thorne's personal space. "This is a private showroom for serious clientele. We don't allow loitering." Thorne finally raised his eyes. They were heavy-lidded, sharp, and possessed the kind of weight that usually made defendants reconsider their plea deals. "I am testing the merchandise." Thorne said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone. "I'm in the market for a new desk for my home study. This particular piece has excellent craftsmanship." "It's $12,000. Vance sneered, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked around the empty store, checking to see if his 2 sales associates were watching his display of authority. "And I don't think you have $12,000 to spend on furniture today, so I'm going to ask you one time to get up and walk out that door before I have to get security involved." Thorne leaned back in the leather chair, clasping his hands over his stomach. He had dealt with death row inmates, cartel leaders, and corrupt senators. A 20-something manager with a bad haircut and a worse attitude was barely a blip on his radar. But Thorne also knew that this wasn't just about him. It was about what happened to men who looked like him when they didn't have a badge or a title to protect them. "You're making an assumption based on my appearance," Thorne said calmly. "That is a dangerous game to play, young man. I have money. I have intent to purchase. By asking me to leave based on nothing but your own prejudice, you are treading into dangerous legal territory." Vance laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. "Legal territory? Listen to you. You think because you use big words I'm going to be intimidated, I have the right to refuse service to anyone. And I'm refusing it to you. Get out." Thorne didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply checked his watch. "Refusal of service must be based on conduct, not identity. I haven't raised my voice. I haven't damaged property. I haven't threatened anyone. Your refusal is arbitrary and discriminatory. I suggest you reconsider." Vance's face turned a shade of blotchy red. He wasn't used to being challenged, certainly not by someone he deemed beneath him. He pulled his phone from his pocket. "Okay, have it your way. I'm calling the police, and when they get here you're going to jail for trespassing." "By all means," Thorne said, gesturing toward the phone. "Make the call, but be very careful what you say to the dispatcher. False reporting is a crime." Vance didn't heed the warning. He dialed 911, his eyes locked on Thorne with a look of pure malice. He wanted a scene. He wanted to see this man humbled. He had no idea that he was lighting a fuse that would blow up his entire world. Kyle Vance walked toward the front of the store, putting distance between himself and Thorne, but making sure he was still loud enough to be heard. He held the phone to his ear, his posture stiff with self-righteous indignation. Thorne remained seated at the desk, pulling out his own mobile device. He wasn't recording videos. He was sending a text message to his chief of staff potential situation at Sterling Collection 4th Avenue, documenting timeline. Do not intervene yet. Yes, emergency, Vance said into the phone, his voice pitching up an octave to feign distress. I'm at the Sterling Collection Furniture Gallery. I have a man here who is refusing to leave. He's being belligerent. He's threatening my staff. Thorne raised an eyebrow, but remained silent. He looked over at the two sales associates standing near the fabric swatches. Both were women in their 40s. They looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight, avoiding eye contact with both their manager and the customer. They knew Thorne hadn't threatened anyone. They knew this was wrong. But they also knew Vance was petty and vindictive, so they stayed silent. He's a black male, large build, maybe 60s. Vance continued, painting a picture of a physical threat. He's sitting at one of the desks and refusing to get up. I've asked him to leave 5 times. I'm afraid he might become violent. Please send officers immediately. Vance hung up the phone and turned back to Thorne with a smug grin. They're on their way. 5 minutes. You have 5 minutes to save yourself a criminal record. You just committed a Class A misdemeanor. Thorne said, his voice flat and factual. Filing a false police report. You told the dispatcher I was threatening your staff. We both know that is a lie. The recording of that call is now evidence. It's your word against mine. Vance scoffed. And who do you think they're going to believe, the manager of a high-end store or the guy who won't leave? That is the unfortunate reality of our system, Thorne admitted. They will likely believe you, initially, but evidence has a way of surfacing. At that moment, the bell above the door chimed. A middle-aged white couple walked in looking for sofas. They stopped immediately, sensing the tension in the room. They saw Thorne sitting calmly at the desk and Vance standing over him with a flushed face. The woman in the couple, noticing Vance's aggressive stance, slowly reached into her purse and pulled out her smartphone. She held it low near her waist, but the camera lens was pointed directly at the interaction. Thorne noticed it. He gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The court of public opinion was now in session. You're still here, Vance barked, playing to an audience he didn't realize was turning against him. I told you this is a private business. We operate by appointment only for high-value items. The sign on your door says, Walk-ins welcome, Thorne noted. And the door was unlocked. There is no signage indicating appointment requirements. You are fabricating policies on the fly to justify exclusion. I don't need to explain my policies to you, Vance shouted. Actually, you do, Thorne replied. Under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, places of public accommodation cannot discriminate based on race. By creating arbitrary barriers for me that you did not apply to the couple who just entered, you are in direct violation of federal law. Vance looked at the couple who were standing frozen near the entrance. Folks, I'll be with you in a moment. I'm just dealing with a trespasser. He doesn't look like a trespasser, the husband said, his voice tentative. He looks like he's shopping. Sir, please don't interfere, Vance snapped. This is a security matter. Thorne remained perfectly still. He placed his hands on the desk palms, flat and visible. He knew exactly what was coming. He knew the police protocol for a belligerent trespasser call. They would come in hot. They would be adrenaline dumped. They would see a black man in a suit and see a threat, not a dignitary. He needed to be physically non-threatening while remaining legally immovable. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. They cut through the afternoon traffic, a sound Thorne had heard thousands of times. Usually he was on the side of the people in those cars. Today he was the target. 2 uniformed officers entered the store with a rush of tactical energy. The first was Officer Miller, a man in his early 30s with a buzz cut and a look of intense irritation. He had his hand resting near his holster. Trailing him was Officer Higgins, older, heavier, looking more tired than aggressive. But Miller was the lead, and Miller was looking for a fight. Who called? Miller demanded, his eyes scanning the room. "I did," Vance said, stepping forward, instantly transforming his demeanor from bully to victim. "Thank God you're here. He's right there. He refuses to leave. I've asked him 10 times. He's scaring my other customers." Miller turned his gaze toward Thorne. He didn't see the bespoke suit. He didn't see the calm demeanor. He saw a suspect. He marched over to the desk, closing the distance aggressively. "Sir, stand up," Miller commanded. Thorne didn't move. He kept his hands flat on the desk. "Officer, I am a customer in this store. I have not committed any crime. This manager is refusing service based on my race, which is a civil rights violation. I am waiting for him to process my purchase or provide a lawful reason for my removal." "I don't care about your purchase," Miller snapped. "The owner of the property wants you gone. That means you leave. Now stand up." "I am not trespassing," Thorne said, his voice steady. "To be trespassing, I must be unlawfully on the premises. I entered legally during business hours. His revocation of consent is based on an illegal premise, racial discrimination. Therefore, his order to leave is unlawful, and I am not obligated to comply with an unlawful order." Miller's face hardened. He wasn't used to suspects citing case law. He interpreted the intelligence as insolence. "I'm not going to argue the law with you. You're trespassing. Stand up or I will remove you." "Officer," Thorne said, looking Miller directly in the eyes, "I am asking you to de-escalate. I am asking you to speak to the witnesses. Speak to the couple by the door. Ask them if I have been belligerent. Ask them if I have threatened anyone. You are operating on the word of a man who lied to your dispatcher." "Sir, stand up," Miller shouted, reaching for his handcuffs. "You are under arrest for criminal trespass and obstruction." "On what grounds is the obstruction?" Thorne asked. "I am sitting. I am not resisting. I am speaking. Speech is not obstruction." "You are refusing a lawful order," Miller said. He moved around the desk. He grabbed Thorne's left arm and yanked it. Thorne didn't pull back. He allowed his arm to be moved, but he didn't help. He went limp, a passive resistance technique he had seen used in protests for decades. "I am not resisting," Thorne stated clearly for the camera he knew was recording from the doorway. "I am complying with your physical force, but I do not consent to this search or seizure. You are violating my Fourth Amendment rights." "Stop talking," Miller grunted, twisting Thorne's arm behind his back with unnecessary force. He shoved Thorne's face toward the polished wood of the desk. "Give me your other hand." Officer Higgins stepped in nervously. "Miller, maybe we should just ID him first. He's pretty well-dressed man." "He's a trespasser who thinks he's a lawyer," Miller spat. "Cuff him." Thorne allowed his right hand to be pulled back. The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked shut on his wrists. The sound was sharp in the quiet store. The couple by the door were gasping. The woman was filming her hand shaking. "You are making a mistake," Thorne said quietly. "A mistake that will cost this city dearly." Yeah, tell it to the judge," Miller said, hauling Thorne up from the chair. Thorne almost smiled. "I am the one who appoints the judges," he thought. But he said nothing. He let them handle him. He let them push him toward the door. He wanted every second of this recorded. He wanted the indignity to be absolute so the vindication could be total. The walk from the desk to the patrol car was only about 50 feet, but it felt like a mile. Miller gripped Thorne's bicep with bruising force, parading him past the expensive leather sectionals and the imported rugs. Kyle Vance watched with a look of triumph crossing his arms and shaking his head as if he were the one who had been wronged. "That's what happens," Vance muttered as they passed. "Trash." Thorne caught the word. He filed it away. It would look excellent in the deposition. They burst out of the cool air-conditioned store into the bright Chicago sunlight. The sidewalk was busy. People stopped. They saw two white police officers escorting a distinguished black man in handcuffs. Phones came out. The court of public opinion was expanding its jury pool. "Officer," Thorne said as they reached the car, "my wallet is in my inside jacket pocket. It contains my identification. I strongly suggest you check it before you place me in that vehicle." "We'll check it at the station," Miller said, opening the back door of the cruiser. "Watch your head." He pushed Thorne down into the hard plastic seat. The space was cramped. The handcuffs bit into Thorne's wrists. The door slammed shut, sealing him in the smell of stale sweat and industrial cleaner. Thorne shifted to get as comfortable as possible. He closed his eyes for a moment, controlling his breathing. His heart rate was elevated. He was human after all, but his mind was cold, calculating steel. In the front seat, Miller and Higgins got in. Miller was pumped up, breathing hard. "Guy thinks he can just talk his way out of anything. I know the law. I hate that type." Higgins looked in the rearview mirror at Thorne. "He was pretty calm, Miller. And that suit, that's not a cheap suit. Maybe we should have run his name." "He wouldn't give it." Miller lied to himself. "He was obstructing. We'll print him, book him, kick him loose in 4 hours. Standard trespass." Miller started the engine. "Dispatch, we're 10 to 15 with one male subject, en route to the precinct." Thorne sat in the back listening. He knew the precinct they were heading to, the 12th district. He knew the captain there. He knew the layout of the holding cells. He had toured that facility 3 months ago to announce a new grant for community policing. The irony was palpable. The drive took 15 minutes. Thorne used the time to memorize the officers' names from their display on the dashboard computer, which was partially visible through the grate. Officer J. Miller. Officer P. Higgins. He memorized the time. He memorized the conversation they were having about lunch, completely oblivious to the radioactive material they were transporting in their back seat. When they pulled into the sally port of the police station, the heavy garage doors rolled down, shutting out the light. Thorne was pulled out of the car. His legs were stiff. Miller did a quick pat-down, his hands moving roughly over the expensive fabric of the suit. He found the wallet, but didn't open it. He just shoved it into an evidence bag he was holding. "Let's go," Miller said. They walked him through the sterile concrete hallways. They passed a few other officers who looked up, saw a standard arrest, and looked back down. Bias was a funny thing. It made the extraordinary look mundane. They just saw another black man in cuffs. They didn't look closer. Until they reached the booking desk. The booking room was a flurry of activity. Phones ringing, radios, chatter, the clank of cell doors. Behind the high desk sat Sergeant Reynolds. Reynolds was an institution in the 12th District. He was 60 years old, black-tired and waiting for his pension. He had seen it all. He kept his head down, filling out paperwork as Miller and Higgins approached with their prisoner. "Possession?" Reynolds asked without looking up. "Trespassing," Miller said, tossing the evidence bag containing Thorne's wallet onto the counter. "Belligerent. Refused to leave a furniture store. Claimed he knew the law." Reynolds sighed. "Name?" "Refused to give it," Miller said. "We gotta run prints." Reynolds finally looked up. "All right, sir, step forward. I need you to—" Reynolds' voice died in his throat. The pen dropped from his hand and clattered onto the desk. He stood up slowly, his eyes widening until they looked like they might pop out of his head. He looked at Thorne. Then he looked at the wall behind him where a framed certificate of commendation for the precinct hung. The certificate was signed by the state attorney general. Reynolds looked back at Thorne. Thorne held his gaze, his expression stony. "Officer Miller," Reynolds whispered. His voice was trembling. "Yeah, Sarge." Miller was busy unclipped his radio, oblivious. "Do you know who this is?" Reynolds asked, his voice rising to a panic. "Some guy who wouldn't leave a furniture store," Miller said. Reynolds walked around the desk. He didn't walk, he rushed. He moved with a speed that defied his age. He went straight to Thorne. "Sir, Mr. Attorney General, I am so sorry. Miller froze. Higgins choked on the air he was breathing. The entire booking room went silent. The typist stopped typing. The other prisoners stopped talking. "Attorney General?" Miller stammered. He looked at the man in cuffs. He looked at the suit again. The realization hit him like a freight train. Reynolds was fumbling for his keys. "Get these off him." "Miller, give me your keys. Now." Miller stood paralyzed, so Reynolds grabbed his own keys. His hand shook as he inserted the small key into the handcuffs on Thorne's wrists. The mechanism clicked. The cuffs fell away. Thorne brought his hands in front of him. He rubbed his wrists slowly, looking at the red marks left by the metal. He didn't speak immediately. He let the silence stretch. He let it become unbearable. He looked at Miller, who was now pale. His mouth slightly open, the color draining from his face as he realized his career was effectively over. Thorne turned his attention to Reynolds. "Sergeant Reynolds, good to see you again. I believe the last time we met was at the Policemen's Benevolent Association dinner." "Yes, sir. Yes, Mr. Attorney General," Reynolds said, sweating profusely. "Sir, there's been a terrible mistake." "A mistake implies an accident," Thorne said, his voice ice cold. "This was not an accident. This was a systematic failure of procedure judgment and basic constitutional adherence." Thorne reached out and picked up the evidence bag from the counter. He opened it and took out his wallet. He pulled out his badge, the gold shield of the Attorney General, and placed it on the counter with a heavy clack. "I want the Chief of Police here," Thorne said softly. "I want him here in 20 minutes, and I want the body camera footage from these two officers uploaded and secured immediately before anyone accidentally deletes it. Do I make myself clear?" "Crystal clear, sir," Reynolds said. "I'm calling the chief now." Thorne turned to Miller. The young officer looked like he wanted to vomit. "You have the right to remain silent," Thorne said to Miller. "I suggest you use it." The next hour was a blur of brass. The chief of police arrived in 14 minutes, breathless, his uniform hastily buttoned. He found Marcus Thorne sitting in the captain's office, not in a cell sipping a cup of coffee that Reynolds had personally fetched. But the atmosphere wasn't friendly. It was an inquisition. "General Thorne," the chief said, "I cannot express how deeply sorry I am. This is unacceptable." "It's not just unacceptable, Chief," Thorne said, standing up. "It's illegal, and it's commonplace. That's the problem. If I were a school teacher or a janitor or an accountant, I would still be in that cell. I would be facing charges. I would have an arrest record that would ruin my employment." "We will handle this internally," the chief promised. "Officer Miller will be suspended pending investigation." "No," Thorne said. "You won't handle this internally, because I am appointing a special prosecutor. My office cannot handle it due to the conflict of interest, so I am bringing in the DOJ. We are going to audit the stops and arrests of this precinct, and we are going to audit that furniture store." Thorne walked out of the station an hour later. He didn't sneak out the back. He walked out the front door. The media was already there. The video from the furniture store had gone viral. The woman who filmed it had uploaded it with the caption, "Manager calls cops on black man for sitting. Cops arrest him. Turns out he's the Attorney General." It had 3 million views in 2 hours. Microphones were thrust in his face. "Mr. Attorney General, Mr. Thorne, is it true you were arrested?" Thorne stopped. He adjusted his cuffs. He looked directly into the cameras. "Today I was reminded," he told the press, "that in the eyes of some, my achievements, my title, and my service to this state mean nothing compared to the color of my skin. I was arrested for the crime of shopping, but this isn't about me. It's about every citizen who doesn't have a gold badge to pull out of their wallet when their rights are violated. We are going to fix this." While Thorne was speaking, corporate lawyers were descending on the Sterling collection. Kyle Vance was in the break room watching the news on his phone. He saw Thorne's face. He saw the title State Attorney General on the chyron. He felt the blood leave his head. The district manager walked in. He didn't even look at Vance. You're fired. Get your things. You have 5 minutes. But I followed policy, Vance stammered. You called the police on the Attorney General Kyle. You destroyed this brand in an afternoon. Get out. Vance walked out of the store to find a news crew waiting for him. He tried to cover his face, but it was too late. He was the face of racism in Chicago. The fallout was swift, brutal, and necessary. Thorne didn't let up. He didn't accept the private apologies from the mayor or the governor. He filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the city and the furniture company. The discovery phase of the lawsuit against the police department was damning. It revealed that Officer Miller had a history of contempt of cop arrests, arresting people who questioned his authority. It showed that the precinct had a pattern of arresting black men for trespassing in high-end areas at a rate 4 times higher than white suspects. The furniture store was worse. Their internal emails revealed a watch list policy that encouraged managers to remove urban youth and unqualified browsers to maintain the store's exclusive atmosphere. Kyle Vance had been following an unwritten rule that was rot at the core of the company. 6 months later, the settlement was announced. The furniture company, facing a total boycott and a stock price that had tanked by 40%, agreed to pay $4 million. They also agreed to mandatory bias training and a complete overhaul of their management. The city settled for an undisclosed amount, but the money wasn't the point. The point was the consent decree. The police department was forced to accept federal oversight. Officer Miller was fired and decertified. He would never be a cop again. Officer Higgins was suspended and retrained. Thorne stood at a podium to announce the resolution. He looked tired. The fight had taken a toll, but he held a check in his hand. This settlement, Thorne said, holding up the $4 million check from the furniture store, will not go to me. I don't need it. This money is starting the Thorne Legal Defense Fund. It will provide top-tier legal representation for indigent defendants who are wrongfully accused of trespassing and low-level offenses. It will fight for the people who can't fight for themselves. The room erupted in applause, but Thorne didn't smile. He looked solemn. That evening, Marcus Thorne sat in his home study. He was sitting at his new desk. He hadn't bought it from the Sterling collection. He had commissioned it from a local black carpenter. It was beautiful, sturdy, and honest. He sat in the silence of his home looking at the framed photo of his grandfather on the wall. His grandfather had been a sharecropper who wasn't allowed to walk on the sidewalk when a white man passed. 2 generations later, his grandson was the chief law enforcement officer of the state. And yet, it had taken only 5 minutes for a store manager and a police officer to strip all that away and reduce him to just a suspect. Thorne took a sip of scotch. He thought about Officer Miller's face when he realized who he had handcuffed. It was a look of fear, yes, but it was fear of consequences, not fear of the moral weight of his actions. That was the problem. They were sorry they got caught. They weren't sorry they did it. He realized that his victory was an anomaly. If he had been anyone else, he would have a criminal record right now. He would have a mugshot online. He would have lost his job. The system had worked for him only because he was the system. Thorne leaned forward, looking into the empty room, speaking to a ghost that wasn't there. We have so much work to do. Work. Have you ever been judged by your appearance in a place of business? Have you ever felt that sinking feeling when authority figures side with the wrong person? It's a heavy burden to carry, and not everyone has a badge to shield them. Drop a comment below if you think justice was served in this story. And if you believe that we need to hold our institutions to a higher standard, hit that subscribe button. We need to keep telling these stories until we don't have to anymore. Thank you for watching. Be safe out there and know your rights.
Ma'am, put the phone down and step away from the building. I'm not asking again.
Officer, I'm on a public sidewalk. Tell me
Turn
the
around.
time, right now.
You're casing windows.
No.
Drop the bag and give me your ID.
No reasonable suspicion. I do not consent to a search. This is
Turn
unlawful.
around. You're obstructing.
I am not resisting. You're violating my...
Ma'am, put the phone down and step away from the building. I'm not asking again. The voice cut through the crisp mid-morning air like a jagged knife. It was aggressive, loud, and completely out of place on a sunny Tuesday at 10:30 a.m. in the heart of the financial district. Elara Vance didn't flinch. She didn't drop her phone. She didn't even look up immediately. At 54 years old, with her salt and pepper hair pulled back into an immaculate chignon and wearing a tailored navy suit that cost more than most people's first cars, she was not accustomed to being addressed like an unruly teenager. She was reviewing a complex motions docket on her tablet, waiting for her double espresso and a colleague from the U.S. Attorney's Office. "I am talking to you. Step away from the wall." Elara slowly lowered her tablet. She turned her head, her movements deliberate and calm, to face the source of the noise. Standing 10 feet away was Officer Brody Miller. He was young, maybe 29, with a high and tight haircut and a posture that screamed he was looking for a fight. His hand was resting dangerously close to his holster thumb hooked over his belt, chest puffed out. "Officer," Elara said, her voice possessing the cool, resonant timbre of someone who had spent 25 years speaking in federal courtrooms. "Are you addressing me?" "I'm addressing the woman loitering outside a business and casing the parking lot," Miller snapped, closing the distance between them. "I've been watching you for 5 minutes, walking back and forth, looking into the windows, checking your phone. We've had break-ins in this district. You need to explain what you're doing here." Elara adjusted her glasses. "I am waiting for a coffee," she said simply. "And I am reading work documents. Pacing while reading is a habit, not a crime." "It looks like casing to me," Miller retorted. He was close enough now that she could see the nameplate on his uniform. B. Miller. He looked like the type of man who had never been told no in his life, or at least never accepted it with grace. "I need you to set your bag on the ground and give me your ID. Now." Elara looked at the leather briefcase at her feet. Inside were sealed grand jury indictments, sensitive personnel files for the Southern District, and her personal effects. There was absolutely no way this officer was touching that bag. "Officer Miller," Elara said, turning her body fully toward him, but keeping her hands clasped loosely in front of her. "You are making a significant assumption. I am standing on a public sidewalk during business hours engaging in lawful behavior. You have no reasonable suspicion that a crime has been committed, is being committed, or is about to be committed. Therefore, I am not obligated to provide identification or consent to a search." Miller blinked. He hadn't expected legal terminology. He had expected fear. He had expected a scramble for a driver's license and a stammered apology. Instead, he was getting a lecture from a black woman who looked like she owned the building behind her. "Don't play lawyer with me," Miller sneered, his face flushing a light shade of pink. "Refusing a lawful order is obstruction. Now for the last time, ID." "It is not a lawful order if the stop itself is unconstitutional," Elara replied, her heart rate remaining steady despite the adrenaline beginning to sharpen her senses. She had watched federal judges dress down attorneys for less incompetence than this. "I am a private citizen conducting private business. Unless you can articulate a specific crime, I am suspected of this conversation is a consensual encounter, and I am choosing to end it." She turned back to her tablet. It was a dismissal, a clear signal that she was done. But for Officer Brody Miller, it was an insult he couldn't abide. "Turn around," Miller barked, reaching for his radio. "Dispatch. Show me out with one uncooperative female 400 block of Maine. She's becoming belligerent." Elara sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. She tapped the screen of her phone, ensuring the voice recorder was running. She had hoped to enjoy her coffee. Instead, she was about to teach a master class in civil rights law, whether Officer Miller wanted to attend or not. The atmosphere on the sidewalk shifted instantly. The casual hum of the city traffic, distant construction, the murmur of pedestrians seemed to drop away, replaced by the sharp tension of the confrontation. A few people walking by slowed down. A man in a gray suit stopped near the entrance of the coffee shop, sensing something was wrong. "Officer," Elara said, keeping her voice level but raising the volume slightly so the gathering witnesses could hear. "You just reported over the radio that I am being belligerent. That is a false statement. I am standing still. My hands are visible. I am speaking to you calmly. You are fabricating a narrative to justify an unlawful detention. You're refusing to identify yourself," Miller argued, stepping into her personal space. He was trying to intimidate her physically, using his height and bulk to tower over her. In this state, failure to identify during an investigation is an arrestable offense. "During a lawful investigation," Alara corrected him, not taking a single step back. Hebel v. 6th Judicial District Court of Nevada. The Supreme Court ruled that stop and identify statutes only apply if the initial stop is based on reasonable suspicion properly specific to the individual. You have not articulated that. Looking at windows while waiting for a coffee is not a crime. It is not even suspicious. It is what customers do. Miller's jaw tightened. He wasn't listening to the case law. He was hearing defiance. He was hearing a challenge to his authority in front of an audience. "I don't care what you think the law is," Miller spat. "I'm the one with the badge. I'm telling you that you match the description of a suspect involved in vehicle break-ins." "What description?" Alara asked sharply. "Because 5 minutes ago you said you stopped me because I was pacing. Now suddenly I match a description. Which is it, officer? And let me guess the description. Black female that covers half the population of this city. Is there a height, a weight, a clothing description? Because I am wearing a $2,000 suit and heels. Is your car burglar wearing Italian silk? You're resisting," Miller shouted, his hand moving to his handcuffs. "I am not resisting," Alara narrated for the benefit of the witnesses and her own recording. "I am verbally asserting my Fourth Amendment rights. I am not fleeing. I am not physically pulling away. I am questioning the validity of your authority in this specific instance." "Last chance," Miller growled. "ID or cuffs." Alara looked him dead in the eye. She saw the uncertainty behind his aggression. He knew deep down that he was on shaky ground, but he had gone too far to back down without losing face. He was trapped by his own ego. "My identification is in my bag," Alara said. "However, I am not giving it to you because you have not met the burden of proof required to demand it. If you arrest me, you will be violating clearly established law, you will lose qualified immunity, and you will be sued." "That's it," Miller snapped. He lunged forward, grabbing Alara's left wrist and twisting it behind her back with unnecessary force. "I am not resisting," Alara said loudly, wincing as her shoulder joint was torqued. "I am complying with your physical force. Witnesses, please note I am offering no resistance." "Stop fighting!" Miller yelled, a tactic trained to make bystanders believe the suspect is the aggressor. He shoved her against the brick wall of the coffee shop. Her cheek pressed against the rough masonry. "I am not fighting," Alara stated clearly. "You are assaulting a federal employee." Miller paused for a microsecond as the words registered, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He clicked the first cuff onto her wrist. "Federal employee." "Yeah, right. And I'm the president. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and disorderly conduct." The cold metal bit into her skin. Alara closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself. She wasn't afraid. She was furious. But she knew that anger was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. She needed to be perfect. She needed to be the calmest person in the equation. "You are making a mistake that you cannot undo," she whispered, her voice like ice. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting tight was sickeningly loud. Bystanders were now openly filming. The man in the gray suit had his phone out, holding it horizontally, capturing the entire scene. A woman near the curb shouted, "Hey!" She wasn't doing anything. "We saw her just standing there." Officer Miller ignored them. He spun Alara around, grabbing her by the bicep. "You can tell it to the judge," he muttered, pulling her away from the wall. "I work for the judges," Alara said, her voice dropping to a dangerously low register. I have been the senior court clerk for the United States District Court for 19 years. The bag you just kicked contains sealed indictments signed by the chief judge this morning. By arresting me, you are technically interfering with federal judicial proceedings. Miller faltered. His grip on her arm loosened slightly. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. The suit, the poise, the way she spoke. It wasn't the frantic speech of someone caught doing something wrong. It was the controlled diction of someone who knew exactly how the system worked because she helped run it. But the crowd was watching. The cameras were rolling. If he let her go now, he would look like a fool. He would be admitting he was wrong. Yeah, sure. Miller blustered, doubling down on his error. Everyone's got a story. You're coming downtown. If you're who you say you are, it'll get sorted out. But right now, you're going in the car. He marched her toward his patrol cruiser parked illegally in a loading zone. Alara walked with her head high. She didn't struggle. She didn't cry. She walked with the dignity of a queen being led to the guillotine, knowing full well that the executioner was the one who would eventually lose his head. My bag, Alara said. It contains sensitive federal property. If you leave it on the sidewalk, that is a separate federal felony. Miller groaned, annoyed. He dragged her to the car, opened the back door, and roughly guided her inside. The hard plastic seat was uncomfortable, and the space was cramped. Sit tight, he said. He walked back, grabbed her leather briefcase, and tossed it onto the front passenger seat of his cruiser. He got in the driver's seat and slammed the door. The interior of the car smelled of stale coffee and sanitizer. Through the partition, Alara watched the back of his head. She saw him check his reflection in the rearview mirror. He looked flustered. He was breathing hard. What's your name? Miller asked, starting the engine. He didn't turn around. Alara said nothing. I asked you a question. Name and date of birth. Alara remained silent. She had told him her identification was in the bag. He had chosen to arrest her instead of investigating. Now she would exercise her right to remain silent until she had counsel or until she was in front of a supervisor who had the brain power to understand the catastrophe unfolding. Fine. Be that way. We'll fingerprint you at the station. See if you have warrants. He pulled out into traffic, cutting off a delivery truck. Alara noted the time on the dashboard clock, 10:42 a.m. She noted his speed, 45, in a 25 zone without lights or sirens. She noted that he hadn't seatbelted her in a violation of department safety policy. She was building a file in her mind. Every second of this encounter was being cataloged, indexed, and cross-referenced with department policy and constitutional law. Officer Brody Miller thought he was driving a suspect to booking. In reality, he was driving his career off a cliff. The drive to the precinct took 12 minutes. For Officer Miller, it must have felt like an eternity. The silence from the back seat was oppressive. Usually people in the back of his car were screaming, crying, begging, or cursing him out. They kicked the doors. They spat. They offered bribes. Alara Vance did none of those things. She sat perfectly still, staring at the back of his neck. Miller turned on the radio to drown out the silence, but the chatter of the dispatcher only seemed to amplify the tension. He glanced in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were locked on him. They weren't angry eyes, not anymore. They were analytical. It was like being examined by a coroner while he was still alive. You know, Miller said, trying to break the tension, trying to convince himself he was in the right. If you had just shown me your ID, none of this would have happened. You did this to yourself. Alara didn't blink. She didn't respond. She knew exactly what he was doing. He was soliciting an admission. He wanted her to say, I know I'm sorry, so he could put it in his report. He wanted absolution. She would give him nothing. Miller shifted in his seat. The doubt was creeping in now, cold and slithering. What if she is telling the truth, he thought. Federal court clerk. No, that's impossible. She was just standing there. She fits the profile. But the profile was weak and he knew it. Black woman near a building wasn't a profile. It was a prejudice. He pulled into the sally port of the downtown precinct. The heavy metal doors rolled down behind them, sealing them inside the concrete belly of the station. He put the car in park and took a deep breath. "All right," he said, feigning a confidence he no longer felt. "End of the line. Let's get you processed." He got out and opened the rear door. He grabbed Alara's arm again to pull her out. "I can walk," she said. It was the first thing she had said in 20 minutes. The authority in her voice made him let go of her arm instinctively. She stepped out of the vehicle, straightened her jacket as best she could with her hands cuffed behind her, and looked around the bay. A few other officers were unloading suspects. They looked at Alara dressed in her power suit, looking utterly out of place amidst the drunks and the petty thieves, and then they looked at Miller. Their expressions were puzzled. Miller grabbed her briefcase from the front seat. "Let's go." He led her through the heavy security doors and into the intake room. It was a loud, chaotic space filled with the smell of sweat and industrial cleaner. Behind the high desk sat Sergeant Thomas, a man with 30 years on the job, a thick mustache and eyes that had seen everything. Thomas looked up as Miller approached with Alara. He looked at Miller. Then he looked at Alara. He looked at the expensive suit. He looked at the handcuffs. He looked back at Miller. "What do we have here, Miller?" Thomas asked, his voice gravelly and suspicious. "Refusal to identify obstruction disorderly," Miller recited, placing the leather briefcase on the counter. "Suspect was casing vehicles in the financial district, became belligerent when approached." Sergeant Thomas looked at Alara. "That true, ma'am. You were casing cars in a $1,000 suit." "I am invoking my right to remain silent," Alara said politely. "However, I would ask you to open that briefcase and look at the identification in the front pocket. I believe Officer Miller failed to verify my identity before initiating this arrest." Thomas raised an eyebrow. He reached for the bag. "Be careful, Sarge," Miller said. "She claims she's some federal big shot." Thomas shot Miller a look that said, "Shut up." He unbuckled the leather flap of the briefcase. He reached into the front pocket and pulled out a slim leather wallet. He opened it. The room seemed to go quiet. Thomas stared at the credentials. He saw the Department of Justice seal. He saw the holographic overlay. He saw the card that read Alara Vance, Senior Clerk of Court, U.S. District Court, Southern District. He saw the secondary card, Top Secret Security Clearance. Thomas slowly closed the wallet. He looked up at Miller. His face had gone pale. "Miller," Thomas said, his voice very, very quiet. "Did you read this ID?" "She wouldn't give it to me," Miller said defensively. "I told you she resisted." "You detained a federal official," Thomas said, sliding the wallet across the counter so Miller could see it. "And not just any official. This woman runs the chief judge's docket. Do you know who signs our search warrants, Miller? Do you know who signs the wiretap authorizations you guys beg for every week?" Miller looked at the ID. The blood drained from his face. "Senior Clerk of Court." "Oh," Miller whispered. "Yeah. Oh," Thomas said. He picked up the phone on his desk. "Watch Commander. Now." The intake room was usually a place of noise and movement, but a strange bubble of stillness had formed around the intake desk. Other officers sensed the disaster and stepped back. No one wanted to be near the blast radius of what was about to happen. Officer Miller stood frozen, staring at the credentials. I didn't know," he stammered. "She didn't tell me." "I told you exactly who I was," Alara said. Her voice was calm, cutting through his excuses. "I told you I was a federal employee. I told you I worked for the courts. You told me you didn't care." "Uncuff her," Sergeant Thomas barked at Miller. "Right now." Miller fumbled for his keys. His hands were shaking. He stepped behind Alara and unlocked the handcuffs. As soon as her hands were free, Alara rubbed her wrists. There were deep red indentations where the metal had dug in. "I need photographs of these injuries," Alara said to Sergeant Thomas, "for the file." "Ma'am, we can—" Miller started. "Quiet," Thomas snapped. "You don't talk anymore, Miller. You stand in the corner and you wait." The door to the intake room swung open and Lieutenant Henderson, the watch commander, strode in. He was a tall man with graying hair and a permanent scowl. "What is the problem, Thomas? I've got a briefing in 10 minutes. "Problem is an understate, Lieutenant," Thomas said. He gestured to Alara. "Officer Miller here just arrested Alara Vance." Lieutenant Henderson froze. He knew the name. Everyone in command knew the name. Alara Vance was the gatekeeper. If you needed a warrant at 3 a.m. on a Saturday, you called Alara Vance and she woke up the judge. She was a legend in the legal community for her efficiency and her zero-tolerance policy for incompetence. Henderson looked at Alara, then at the red marks on her wrists, then at Miller, cowering in the corner. "Ms. Vance." Henderson said, his voice changing instantly to a tone of deferential panic. I am incredibly sorry. There must be a massive misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding, Lieutenant," Alara said. She reached into her bag, checking that her files were undisturbed. "Officer Miller profiled me, detained me without reasonable suspicion, assaulted me, and arrested me for asserting my constitutional rights. It was quite clear." "We can release you immediately," Henderson said quickly. "This never has to go on paper. We can call it a consensual transport. We'll get you a car back to your office right now." Alara laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. "Lieutenant, do you really think I'm going to let you unarrest me so you can bury this statistics?" She shook her head. "No. You brought me in. You booked me. I want the booking sheet. I want the arrest record. I want the mugshot taken." "Ms. Vance, please," Henderson pleaded. "If we book you, it creates a record. It complicates things." "It complicates things for you," Alara corrected. "For me, it creates evidence. I want the full procedure. Process me, print me, and then release me on my own recognizance. Everything by the book. Because when I file my lawsuit tomorrow morning, I want the paper trail to be impeccable." Henderson looked at Miller with eyes that promised murder. "Process her," he told Thomas through gritted teeth. "And Miller, give me your gun and your badge. You're relieved of duty pending an investigation. Get out of my sight." The next 40 minutes were the most surreal of Alara's life. She was fingerprinted by a technician who apologized every time he touched her hand. She stood for a mugshot, keeping her chin high and her expression defiant. She signed the property release forms. Every officer in the room treated her like she was made of glass. They brought her water. They offered her a chair in the captain's office instead of the holding cell. But Alara refused the special treatment. She sat on the hard metal bench in the holding area right next to a young woman who had been brought in for shoplifting. "What you in for?" the girl asked, looking at Alara's suit. "Waiting for coffee while black," Alara said. The girl snorted. "Yeah, that'll do it." When the paperwork was finally done, Lieutenant Henderson personally escorted Alara out of the station. "Ms. Vance again on behalf of the department." "Save it for the deposition, Lieutenant," Alara said, stepping out into the sunlight. The city looked exactly the same as it had 2 hours ago, but everything had changed. "I'll be in touch." She hailed a cab. She didn't go back to work. She went straight to the office of the best civil rights litigator in the city, a man she had watched argue cases for a decade. He was surprised to see her without an appointment, but when she told him the story, he canceled his afternoon meetings. "You have the body cam footage?" the lawyer asked. "Not yet," Alara said. "But I will. I know exactly how to subpoena it, and I know Miller's history. I've seen his name on warrant applications before. They're always thin on probable cause. He has a habit of hunches. We're going to expose all of it." The next morning, the lawsuit was filed. Vance versus City of San Diego et al. It was a masterpiece of legal drafting. It didn't just allege a bad arrest. It alleged a systemic failure of training and supervision. It cited the exact timestamps of the encounter. It cited the specific Fourth Amendment violations. The city attorney received the complaint at 9:00 a.m. By 9:15 a.m., he was on the phone with the police chief. "Did we really arrest Elara Vance?" the city attorney asked, rubbing his temples. "Yeah," the chief sighed. "And is the video as bad as she says?" "It's worse," the chief admitted. "He tackles her frank. He tackles a 54-year-old court clerk who is standing still, and she narrates the whole thing like she's teaching a law school class. It's indefensible." The fallout was swift and brutal, but not in the way the police expected. Usually, they could control the narrative. They could release a statement saying the suspect was uncooperative. But they couldn't do that with Elara Vance. Her reputation was bulletproof. The federal judges she worked for were furious. The chief judge called the mayor personally to express his extreme displeasure that his clerk had been shackled. The body camera footage was released 3 weeks later. It went viral within hours. The contrast between Miller's aggressive, frantic bullying and Elara's icy, knowledgeable calm was striking. The moment where she predicted he would lose qualified immunity became a soundbite played on every news station. "Are you a lawyer?" Miller had asked in the video. "I work for the judges," Elara had replied. The internet loved it, but for the city it was a nightmare. Discovery in the lawsuit revealed that Officer Miller had stopped 40 people in the last year for suspicious behavior. 38 of them were Black or Hispanic. None of them had resulted in a conviction for any crime other than resisting arrest. He was a predator with a badge, and the department had let him operate unchecked because his stats looked proactive. Elara sat across from the city attorney during the settlement conference. She didn't look tired. She looked ready. "We are prepared to offer $300,000, the city attorney said, "and Officer Miller has been terminated." "Terminated is a good start," Elara said, "but he needs to be decertified so he can't go work for the sheriff's department next county over. And the money. That's low." "It's standard for a wrongful arrest," the attorney argued. "This wasn't just a wrongful arrest." Elara leaned forward. "This was a humiliation of the judicial system. This was a message to every Black citizen that even if you follow the rules, even if you reach the highest levels of government service, you are still just a body to be policed. The settlement needs to reflect the magnitude of that insult." She slid a piece of paper across the table. $1.5 million, Elara said. "And a mandatory retraining program for the entire patrol division on the Fourth Amendment curriculum to be approved by my office." The city attorney looked at the paper. He looked at the video playing on the screen behind her. He looked at the polling numbers for the mayor. "Done," he said. 6 months after the incident, Elara Vance stood on the steps of the federal courthouse. It was a bright, clear day, much like the one where she had been arrested. Officer Brody Miller was gone. He had been fired decertified and was currently facing potential criminal charges for falsifying police reports. The blue wall of silence had crumbled because Elara had the one thing most victims didn't, the receipts. The settlement money had hit her account a week prior. She hadn't bought a new car or a vacation home. Instead, she had established the Vance Legal Defense Fund, a nonprofit dedicated to providing immediate legal representation for citizens detained in pretext stops. And she watched the people walking by. She saw a young Black man in a hoodie waiting for the bus. She saw a Latina mother pushing a stroller. She knew that for them the danger wasn't over. One lawsuit didn't fix a broken culture, but it was a crack in the dam. Elara took a sip of her coffee, a double espresso she had finally been able to enjoy in peace. She had been lucky. She knew that. If she hadn't been who she was, if she hadn't known the case law, if she hadn't had the confidence to speak up, she might have just been another statistic, another plea deal, another life ruined by a background check. That was the tragedy of it. Her justice came from her privilege of position. The goal now was to ensure that justice didn't require a federal ID card. She checked her watch. 1:00 p.m. Court was back in session. She adjusted her suit jacket, picked up her briefcase, the same one Miller had kicked, and walked back into the building where the laws were written, ready to ensure they were actually followed. The system had tried to break her. Instead, it had just reminded her exactly why she had to keep fighting it. This story isn't just about a bad cop. It's about the knowledge gap that exists between authority and the public. Ilara survived because she knew her rights. But what about the people who don't? What about the teenager who gets scared and runs? What about the person who thinks they have to consent to a search? It makes you wonder. How many Brody Millers are out there right now looking for someone to bully? And how many innocent people are sitting in a cell today because they didn't have a federal badge in their wallet? If this story fired you up, or if you learned something about your own rights, do me a favor, hit that like button and share this with a friend. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to educate an officer on the law? I want to hear your stories. Stay safe, stay educated, and I'll see you in the next one.